Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's guest is Frank Joseph. We will be uncovering the true colonization of America. Nominated by Japan's Savant Society as Professor of World Archaeology, Frank Joseph is a veteran scuba diver and participant in hundreds of underwater expeditions off the coast of Africa, in the eastern Mediterranean Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, and Polynesia. The chief of editor of Ancient American Magazine from 1993 to 2007, he has traveled the world collecting research materials for his 27 published books. Tonight is sure to bring a plethora of clandestine knowledge you didn't learn about in school. How are you tonight? Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, I'm fine. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. I was absolutely blown away today, sir, when I went to your website or your Amazon section and I looked at your 27 books. Wow, you've definitely done your homework and research for quite a bit of time, haven't you?
Yes, sir. I've had a lot of pretty busy life here, as a matter of fact.
Hey, that's fascinating. You know, all of our listeners are absolutely a sponge for knowledge, especially some of the stuff you don't learn about unless you get your own homework done. And I was hoping you could kind of get into some of that with us. It looks like you just wrote a book and talks about the lost colonization of America. First off, though, tell us a bit about yourself and why you decided to start researching this stuff.
Well, actually, I guess it started quite a while ago. I'll be as succinct as I can. I was a student at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, Southern Illinois, back in the 1960s, and I was majoring in English and journalism, but I had minors in American history. And we used to, it was kind of a party school, I guess, in a way, but we used to really party in St. Louis, which was about maybe an hour's drive away from the campus. Sometimes we'd go there on the weekends. And this one weekend, we were headed to St. Louis, and there was a very bad traffic jam. We couldn't really get in across the Mississippi, so we got off the expressway to try to kill some time. There was a sign off the side of the road. It said Cahokia Mounds. Well, we didn't know what that was, probably some Indian burial mound. Pictures, just the usual little primitive grave that the Indians dug for themselves. There's thousands of them across the United States. But we didn't expect much more than that. Well, to make a long story short, we got off the expressway and we were directed by these other signs to an archaeological park, which you can still go today. And at the center of this archaeological park, which is right across the Mississippi River from St. Louis, was this immense pyramid, a gigantic pyramid. And we were utterly blown away. We'd never heard about this thing. It's called Monk's Mound. It's named after some Trappist monks who tried to convert the heathen Indians to Christianity unsuccessfully a couple hundred years ago. But the mound itself was made back, about 900 A.D., a long time ago, well over 1,000 years ago. This mound is not just a heap of earth. It's a construction that involved gravel, different types of imported clays, charcoal, all this to maintain its shape over hundreds and hundreds of years, more than 1,000 years. And it is larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Egypt, which is 13 square acres. This is 14 square acres. It's over 100 feet high, and it was aligned to an astronomical observatory, a kind of an astronomical computer, if you will. So we were all amazed that this thing existed. We'd never heard of it, and we went back to school later on, and we asked our history professor, hey, how come you never mentioned Monk's Mound or Cahokia, which is only about an hour's drive from here? And the response from our professor was, well, we know about it, but it isn't as significant as you think. I said, not as significant as we think. Here's this gigantic pyramid on the other side of the Mississippi River, and you're telling us it's not that significant? We never discussed it in class. So that made me question my education, which I think everybody should do at some point in their life. And I found that there was a lot wrong with our education. And that led me on to a quest to find out who built this place, why was it made, and why were we never told about it. And that was a series of questions that launched me on a lifelong career and traveling around the world to find the answers, which are not always in textbooks or in books of any kind. And that's what really led me in this direction of what is called cultural diffusionism. Archaeology is broken today, American archaeology anyway, is broken today into two schools, two halves, which are fighting each other. One of them is called cultural isolationism, and they're the top dogs now. They're the mainstream archaeologists, And they say that before 1492, nobody from the outside world arrived in America. 1492 is a line drawn in the sand. Columbus was the first and only overseas visitor to the Americas. Now, on the other side, there's persons like myself called cultural diffusionists. And we believe that the oceans of the world were not barriers between peoples, but highways that they traveled. And that Columbus was not the first, but the last to discover America. And that he was preceded by visitors from Asia, West Africa, Europe, that made a tremendous impact on our continent. And once you realize this, it becomes almost obsessive. And it's a great drama that has been kept secret, has been withheld from the masses of American people, and that they deserve to know about it. It's part of their wondrous heritage.
Well, it's absolutely incredible, the amount of information that you have put forth in these books. And you're right. My eyes were open many years ago. I heard that in the Grand Canyon, they were pulling out mummies and Egyptian relics and such. So whether that's true or not, I don't know. And I'd love to get your take on it.
It is.
But, wow.
It is.
So could you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I don't really mention that in this particular book. Just as a prequel to what I'm going to tell you,
Sure.
The book that I've written now is called The Lost Colonies of Ancient America. And this book is different than all the others that I've done, and really different than any other book, thanks to my publisher. I had no intention of writing this book until he told me to do it. He said, well, there are a number of books about these other peoples that came to the Americas, but there's no single book that talks about all of them, all of these different cultures that came here to America before Columbus. So I thought, well, that might be an interesting idea. And so the result is The Lost Colonies of Ancient America consists of this. Each chapter is devoted entirely to one people that arrived here. And I did not put all of the information that substantiated their arrival here. To do that, this book would have run into numerous volumes. But what I did is I selected what I thought is among the best, the most persuasive physical evidence for that. And the story of America, really, that's prehistory, is just a vast panorama. While I was writing this book, even though I had studied these things for years, and this book is an accumulation of the facts that I've been accumulating for the last 30 or almost 40 years now. And as I was writing this book, it was as though for the first time I really had a comprehension of, I could see almost this great drama opening up that I had studied very closely before, but now there's a certain objectivity that's afforded by this book, and it's just a really wonderful, wonderful past that we have. I cannot take credit for many of the discoveries, virtually none of them. I am not an archaeologist. My background professionally is in journalism. I am a science reporter. So I've taken the hard work that others have done, and I've tried to put it into a cohesive, simple story that average persons like myself can understand. It's a popular book. It's meant to be a book for ordinary men and women who have an interest in their past and suspect that what they've been told is not the whole story.
So, another thing, too, that as far as the research that you've done and the different cultures that you found, what was the most prominent culture that you found in America pre-Columbus?
That is a very difficult question to answer because they're all very prominent. There's none that are mysterious. There are some that made a greater impact than others. I'll give you an example, though. You mentioned about the Egyptians in the Grand Canyon. I can say that what was found in the Grand Canyon, although I didn't address it in this book, it is discussed in another book called Discovering the Mysteries of Ancient America. And that book came out some years ago and still available at Amazon.com. And that relates to a discovery that was made by the man by the name of G.E. Kincaid. He was a naturalist photographer in the early part of the 20th century, and he was hired by the Smithsonian Institution to make the first photographic record of the Grand Canyon. This is in the year 1911. And alone in a kind of a large river, flat-bottom boat for rivers, he loaded up his gear and his camera, which was a big clunky affair in those days, of course, and he traveled down the Colorado River, and he made the first terrific photographs, black and white. He was a student and a colleague of Ansel Adams. He's not as well known as him, but his work still exists. And during the course of this photographic expedition that Kincaid had, he found, as he said, a flight of steps that were carved into the side of a great cliff, and it was in an area that no Indian had even gone into. The Indians regarded certain areas, and still regard certain areas, of the Grand Canyon as taboo. And this area was taboo, and here he found a great flight of steps, he says, going up the side of this cliff, this sloping cliff. He followed the steps. He brought a lantern along because he found at the top of the steps was a great cave mouth. It was totally dark, so he went back to his boat, fetched a lantern, came back, and he claims that he found in the inside of this great entrance a series of man-made rooms, chambers that were covered with hieroglyphs of some kind, he said. Now, in one room he found a kind of a barracks, and another kind of a burial ground, a burial area. Another one a kind of a cafeteria, looked like, some kind. Another one was an arsenal for weapons. And the most remarkable was a small chamber that had a dome carved into the naked rock, and underneath this dome was an altar, and on the altar was an idol, which he described as like sticking its tongue out. So some people have thought that this idol represented the Egyptian god Bes, who is portrayed sticking his tongue out, but it appears that what he was seeing was not an Egyptian culture, the results of some Egyptian influences. It appears that what he was seeing was something from Southeast Asia, possibly India. The Smithsonian Institution, after he returned and finished his expedition, the Smithsonian Institution launched its own expedition with him in charge. They went back to the place, and they sealed it up with a great iron gate, which is still there to this day. That area is off limits. If you go to that area, we know where it is. When I say we, I mean my colleagues at Ancient American Magazine. But if you go there to this day, or you try to go there, they will not issue you permits, and you are not allowed to go into that area. But some people have snuck into that same area and have found the cave, but have not been able to get inside because the great iron doors that were erected by the Smithsonian, these chains that are hung across it, are still there. So how about that? I mean, talk about a cover-up. Well, we could have a long, dull evening about all of the cultural crimes committed by the Smithsonian Institution, and that's just one of them.
Oh, sure. I mean, they've got probably more basement space than what's above ground, what people see in Washington, D.C. I'm being sarcastic, but who really knows?
No, I don't think you're probably that far off, actually. There have been a number of terrible things that the Smithsonian has done to maintain their paradigm that there's no chance of anybody from, say, Asia or the outside the ancient world before Columbus impacting America. And that was, of course, some evidence for that. So I think to answer your question, what Kincaid found in 1911 was not evidence of the Egyptians. He did call the writing hieroglyphs, but he was not schooled in ancient civilizations. He was a photographer. He was not schooled in archaeology at all. But from his description that was published in the newspapers, it would appear that what he did see was impact from Southeast Asia, possibly Bali or India itself.
Well, and also when you talked about that relic that was discovered that was possibly Indian, is that around the time, do you think, that the Vedic or the Vedic texts were produced, like 7,000?
It's impossible. Yeah, it's impossible to say, unfortunately, because we don't have enough information to know exactly what Kincaid saw. All we have are his newspaper reports. He was very good eyewitness at seeing telling what he saw, but it isn't specific enough for us to know if this was a medieval influence, because we do know that the ancient Hindus had tremendous seafaring capabilities, and that they definitely were here in the Americas during the medieval period. As far as back as the Vedas, now that's, of course, now we're talking about many thousands of years ago. That's possible, but unfortunately, like I say, we just don't know for sure.
Okay. So in your book that you put together, I think one of the things you discuss is who the first colonizers were of America. Could you share that with the guests?
I believe that the first high civilization, representatives of a high civilization that came to the Americas for the specific act of colonizing America were the Sumerians. And the Sumerians are known as the very first civilizers anywhere. They arose between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia, what is today Iraq and Iran, and they created the first city-states. And what's interesting about the Sumerians is they also created the first writing systems. It's known as cuneiform. The name cuneiform comes from the word wedge or wedge writing. What they would do is they had these little clay tablets, and they would impress into the soft clay with these styluses various letters and numerical values, and they used them primarily as receipts or mathematical tablets, sometimes because they were very great astronomers, and sometimes they used them for religious dedications. And there are thousands and thousands of these cuneiform tablets that have survived, and they've all been translated. Remarkably, there have been dozens, at least, possibly hundreds of these Sumerian cuneiform tablets that have been found on the eastern seaboard of the United States and as far west as Ohio. And that these cuneiform tablets have been found by people digging in their gardens. I talk about that a couple of times in my book. The cuneiform tablets that have been found have been translated easily. And all of the tablets that have been translated, that have been found in the United States, are all basically the same. They're mostly dedication tablets for sacrifices. An example of that is probably the most famous of all of these Sumerian tablets was stolen by a U.S. cavalryman in the 1870s from Chief Joseph. Chief Joseph was the head of the Nez Prince Indians, and in the 1870s, when they were defeated by the U.S. cavalry and he was taken captive, a U.S. cavalryman noticed that around the neck of Chief Joseph was a medicine bag, and the cavalryman snatched it from off his neck, and he went through the medicine bag hoping to find something valuable. The only thing he found there were things like mementos, feathers and stones and things like that. There wasn't any gold, but he did find a cuneiform tablet. Now, this is in the 1870s. Nobody could read cuneiform, Sumerian cuneiform at that time. It wasn't until well after the beginning of the 20th century, the next century, that cuneiform Sumerian tablets could be read. And when this cuneiform tablet was found by this cavalryman, he asked Chief Joseph, he says, "What is this?" And Chief Joseph said, "You are not the first white people that have arrived on the shores of this country. That long ago, other white men came and they treated us much better than you did, and that this is a memento of a white man who arrived here a long time ago, who stayed here and intermarried into my family, and I'm partly related to this man long ago, and this is what he gave my ancestors long ago as a memento." Now, that tablet still exists. It's in Annapolis, the Annapolis Museum. To this day, you can still see it. It's a Chief Joseph tablet. It has been translated only as recently as about 1950, and the tablet just basically said that this is a receipt for a heifer, a kind of a small calf, a cow that's being sacrificed for this woman because she's celebrating her becoming a priestess for the moon goddess. Now, this tablet, which was taken in the 1870s, was completely untranslated, could not be translated back then. So that's one small but very irrevocably persuasive piece of evidence that, in fact, the Sumerians were here. And when you multiply Chief Joseph's Sumerian cuneiform tablet by the dozens that have been found, it amounts to persuasive evidence that the Sumerians were here. This is only a small part of the chapter where I deal with other impact made by the Sumerians. At Caral, for example, in Peru, they created a stone pyramid called a ziggurat. This is a typical type of pyramid that appeared amongst the Sumerian civilizations. So I think that they were the first people that really civilized parts of the New World. They were preceded by other peoples who came here as refugees or for hunting and other various things. But the Sumerians were the first high culture that put down roots in the Americas, specifically in Peru.
Okay. Now, that's some incredible information right there, and that brings me to the next question about the Sumerian tablets. Zacharias Stitchin obviously is very famous for his work and translations. Have you found any tablets or done research that's given you connections to his translations or something similar to the space people, the Anunnaki, the people that came from the stars?
Well, if you look at the original Sumerian documents for Anunnaki, the word Anunnaki means torch-bearer. And the Anunnaki are described at some length in the oldest known novel, or epic if you want to call it, and that is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was the great Sumerian hero, kind of like an Odysseus figure. And even after the Sumerian civilization passed away, the Epic of Gilgamesh was still famous and read throughout the Babylonian culture, Babylonian time. The Anunnaki are never portrayed as coming from the stars. The Anunnaki are always portrayed as torchbearers, meaning they're kind of like spirit guides that take the soul of the deceased to the other world, to the next world. Sometimes they're used as a poetic allegory to describe this one scene in Gilgamesh that comes to mind where there's a great volcano that's exploding, and the fires that are coming out of it look like the Anunnaki. But I didn't find, to be perfectly honest, I found no reference whatsoever between the Anunnaki and any space beings or anything like that at all. Now, this doesn't mean that there isn't any, and that Zacharias Sitchin may have been a far better investigator in these things than I have. I don't intend to have the final word on that. All I know is that as far as my research is concerned, I can find absolutely no connection whatsoever between the Sumerian Anunnaki and any space beings.
Okay. Now, also, I noticed you put together, or you've written books several years ago. I think one was called something about the pre-colonization of Lemuria. Is that correct, or something similar to that?
It's called The Lost Civilization of Lemuria.
Okay, The Lost Civilization of Lemuria. So how many, and obviously I want to get into America as well, but this is kind of bringing me to that. So how many thousands or millions of years ago did that civilization exist? And if so, were these people advanced like like the Sumerians were, or is there a connection there?
Well, what I've tried to do in my books is I've dealt with different aspects of the past. In the Lost Colonies of Ancient America, I'm dealing entirely with historic peoples who mainstream and conventional scholars will agree they existed, and the sources that I use are primarily mainstream sources. And then from the mainstream sources, I build in some of the alternative ideas that have and alternative evidence that's come about. So I combine those two. But my other books have dealt with civilizations which are not as well documented because they are much older. And mankind has been around for a very long time. And yet we're told in our schools that civilization only began very recently, only about 5,000 or 5,500 years ago. There really was nothing that you could call a civilized society before then. I found that to be completely untrue, that civilizations have risen and fallen many times over the past, and that the civilization called Lemuria is just one of many civilizations which flourished even before Sumer, but they suffered natural catastrophes. In the case of Lemuria, for example, they were at the mercy of a tsunami similar to the one that overwhelmed Japan, northern Japan, just a few years ago. The tsunami that overwhelmed Lemuria appears to have been even larger. And for a pre-industrial people to suffer such a natural catastrophe, it's difficult, if not impossible, for them to recover. And that's what's happened. We live on a very dynamic planet, a very geologically unstable world, and we've had whole cities like Pompeii and Herculaneum totally wiped out and reduced to mere legend until they were found by accident. And the same thing has happened to places like Lemuria. Lemuria was a highly advanced society, not so much technologically, although they did have some wonderful technological marvels, to be sure. They were interested in something as advanced as stem cell research. That sounds, what an incredible statement to make, that a people that lived thousands of years ago in the Pacific, their society spanned, I think, from the South Central Pacific up into the Indian Ocean, that they would have created and even known or suspected anything like stem cell research. Well, there's evidence that they did. And the evidence is this, that the Lemurians created these stone towers. Some of these stone towers still exist in Hawaii, on Easter Island, and in Japan. And these not very large stone towers, and there's also some in Bolivia I visited. They're called the Towers of Silustani on Lake Titicaca. And these elegant but rather small stone towers were used as repositories for the umbilical cords of mothers. So when a mother gave birth to a child in this society, after birth, after the child was born, the navel string was cut from the infant and from the mother, and then was preserved under its own name in a specific drawer. And that when this child grew up, or even when it was still a child, if there were any health problems, the shaman that was in charge of this stone tower would take the navel string that was associated with this child and use it for healing purposes. Now, we don't know how they used it, but we do know that they did use it for healing purposes. Sounds an awful lot like stem cell research of some kind. They did use some kind of genetic modification. And when you compare that to the legends that are all through Polynesia, Micronesia, Macronesia, early America, and in Asia, you'll see that they used the navel string, the umbilical cords, for healing purposes. It's really quite remarkable. So there's one example. I go into greater detail than I possibly have time here for in the book to explain just what they were using these things for. You can still visit these stone towers. They are called sometimes navel towers because they contain the umbilical cords of these infant children.
Wow, that's some awesome information right there. So basically, these cultures were doing stuff that scientists are doing now, possibly even more advanced.
I think that they were more advanced in some ways, and certainly not in others. This isn't to say that they had rocket ships or atomic bombs or slot machines or anything like that, or they were even interested in doing such things. But I think what we need to understand is that these ancient cultures lived very close to nature, that they were great observers, keen observers of nature and the cycles and patterns of nature. And from these observations, they evolved a kind of a science, if you will, that was highly advanced, but really quite different than ourselves. Also, every culture, every people have different agendas. They want different things. What do we want? Well, we want to watch more television, and we want higher wages and all that. But people in the ancient world, they didn't have those sort of desires. They had other things. They wanted to be able to live healthy lives. They needed to live healthy. They wanted a successful community. They wanted to defend themselves from the ravages of nature. And so you had, as a consequence, from these different needs, a different type of science evolve.
So it's interesting that it almost appears we continue as a group, as the human archetype, to go through a cycle, and then there's like this reset button. How many thousands of years ago did the Lemurian society exist? How long was it around, and when did it fall, and do you know how it fell?
Yes, as a matter of fact, the evidence is really quite clear. I discussed this in one of my books, The Lost Civilization of Lemuria, which came out in 2006. That's still available. And then again, more recently, in a book called Before Atlantis. And it begins about 75,000 years ago. Now, the story begins about 75,000 years. This is before Lemuria came into existence. And certainly long before mainstream archaeologists will admit to anything like this. But we have to understand, where was humanity 75,000 years ago? That's important to know. Well, we do know what humanity was 75,000 years ago. Through DNA research, we know that the world population of human beings at that time was about 2 million. There were about 2 million of us at that time. Well, yes and no, because Homo sapiens had evolved by that time, to be sure, but there were other variations of hominids that were in existence that were not very successful. As a matter of fact, Homo sapiens, up to that time, 75,000 years ago, was also not particularly successful. He used fire, but he didn't know how to make it. And he'd pretty well been the same, not very productive mammal for many thousands of years. But he had evolved pretty much mostly like ourselves. But we were in a kind of an evolutionary merry-go-round 75,000 years ago. And then one day, in a place in Indonesia, the largest volcanic eruption in all known history, not just human history, but all geologic history, took place. It's called Mount Toba. Still exists to this day. It's called actually Lake Toba. The crater has filled in. And when Mount Toba exploded, it so completely altered the atmosphere that whole species around the world went extinct. And that does not exclude us. We were on the razor's edge of extinction. Overnight, our world population of 2 million human beings went from about 2 million to, if you can believe this or not, about 1,000 breeding pairs. In other words, probably no more than 3, maximum 4,000 people. We went from 2 million to 4,000. And we know that for a fact because the DNA is clear. When this information first came out in the mid-1990s, there was a lot of contention about it, a lot of opposition, and since then, it has mostly been accepted. There's a general consensus now that, yes, in fact, Mount Toba pushed us right to the razor's edge of annihilation. But that was the best thing that ever happened to us, because all of these other attempts at human beings were wiped out. And the only survivors were the strongest, the cleverest, the most adaptive. And that you and I and every human being since that time have that event to thank for our immunity systems that we have inherited over that time. So that was the big step from Homo sapiens to what we are, Homo sapiens sapiens. In that little hyphen, there's a big difference because we are modern humans. And we are adaptive, and we're strong, and we're resilient. We did not have that adaptiveness and that immunity system before. These few thousand survivors, 75,000 years ago, were eventually able to coalesce into successful societies because they were the best of the best in every sense. They formed the basis of society, of a new organized society. And this was the birth of what later cultures called Lemuria or Mu. It went under many different names. Different cultures still refer to it under different names. The Japanese don't call it Mu or Lemuria. They call it Kanai in their traditions. In Micronesia, it's called Kauai Menso. It's the same place. These are just cultural inflections on the same thing. And very slowly over time, this culture developed into the first civilization. And it blossomed probably around, it came into existence, I would say, maybe about 70,000 years ago. That's the birthplace of civilization. It was in the South Central Pacific. And as the culture became more successful and the population grew, this culture spread over many of the islands that still exist today. Most of the islands still exist that spread from, say, Indonesia and parts of Western Polynesia all the way to the Indian Ocean, the Maldives, and so forth. And this society was the very first place where mankind made the step from savagery to civilization. Of course, it's extremely radical. It's not at all accepted by mainstream scientists who just throw up their hands at the mere suggestion of Lemuria, go into fainting spells at the mere mention of Mu. But nonetheless, the evidence, I think, is quite clear, and I've tried to spell it out as best as I can in these two books, Before Atlantis, which came out last year, or maybe it was the year before, I'm not quite sure, and the lost civilization of Lemuria. It's not just a fairy tale. It's not just something made up. It's not channeled information. I have hundreds of footnotes and references for what I'm talking about. It's just a different point of view, a different conclusion. That's all.
Well, and it's absolutely necessary for those that want to at least get closer to the truth or have a different perception on history to do their own research, because they're not going to find it on their own. And, you've put all this information together in your work, and, that's incredible. So,
But what's really great, too, is that the mainstream archaeologists continue to rely on old data that they have found, since the 1950s and 60s. Almost everything I wrote out of before Atlantis came from the internet. I relied on really relatively few published sources, and the reason why is because the internet is bringing out new information and new finds made every day. It was amazing. While I'm writing the book, some of the things that I was writing about were being outdated that quickly after the course of a couple of weeks or months, as new finds are being made. The quickening pace of science, of everything in our society now, this quickening pace is revealing a completely different world than we have been led to believe, and that the science and the archaeology and the history that are taught today will be totally different from the science and history that we're going to be taught in the future, in the very near future. So what I'm talking about may be radical today, but it's going to be old hat tomorrow.
Well, science and medication is the same way, technology, and it's fascinating once again that people will use information that is outdated and not accurate just because of their principles on their education. Like you said earlier, why don't you start to question your education? People spend thousands of dollars to get one, and in so many aspects it's flawed, especially history, because it just continues to rewrite itself. But, I'm going to play the skeptic here for a second with you. And I'm going to bring this up. The internet is like a bathroom wall. Anybody can write anything about anyone, anywhere. And how do you decipher what's true and what isn't?
Well, that's a really great question, and you're absolutely correct. The internet is an information highway, and it's also a sewer, and you really have to be careful what you look at. What my sources, for example, are like National Geographic. I'll use them. I'll use the Smithsonian, the Hated Smithsonian. They bring up a lot of great things. Mostly, though, what I do is I go to science blogs or science magazines, or I will go to university websites. So you're right. You have to be careful what you're looking at. You just can't grab anything that sounds cool or interesting off the internet. I only want the truth. I really only am interested in one thing. I want to know what really happened. I don't want to know what's politically correct. I don't want to know what's accepted. I don't care about that. What really happened? I haven't got time in my life to waste it on other people's opinions and ideas. I want to know what really happened, the truth. What formed our society? What made us the way we are? And where are we going? That's the great utility of history that is also not taught in our schools. That history is not something that happened in the past. That's not it at all. History is living in us. You are the outcome. You are the result of everything that has happened before. And if you're cut off from that, then you don't know what's going to happen. An example of that is our own society. Nobody can understand why Americans are hated so much around the world. And that's because they have no concept of modern American history, what has made so many people now dislike us and become our enemies. They think that, they assume most of these people are just jealous of us. Well, that's not the case at all. There are historical factors that our leaders have unleashed over the past 70 years that have created this situation. It's the same thing like yourself. If someone were to deprive you of all of knowledge of your past, except for the last 2 days, you'd be completely at a loss to deal with the present world. You wouldn't be able to get through a day. That's the same thing with a whole people. If you deprive them of their past or you falsify their past, then they're completely incompetent in dealing with the present and completely outmaneuvered by things that happen to them. They cannot understand what is happening to them. And that's why a clear understanding of the past is I think absolutely vital. The more you understand of the past, the more grounded you are in the future, and the more competent you are to deal with the challenges to come.
Absolutely. And you brought up earlier that one of the best things that happened to mankind was that giant volcano many, many years ago that caused it to go from about 2 million people to, I think you said, approximately 1,000 or 2,000.
Well, 1,000. The geneticists say about 1,000 breeding pairs. Okay. So that would mean then if we just take 1,000 men and women, and they had some kids, and maybe there were some older people that survived, it would say about 3,000, pushing it 4,000. And that was 75,000 years ago.
So with that said, it sounds to me like there's some type of natural or maybe not natural cycle in place that every X amount of years there is once again, a reset, but it's not just a reset. It's something that the strong that survive, the offspring of them will be the new, top of the food chain, I guess you could say, on planet Earth. So you get into work too, don't you? Are you familiar with Michael Cremo?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, he's a very great investigator. It's terrific.
Yes, absolutely. Incredible work. And once again, the stuff that he brings to light, you're not going to find in most archaeology books.
For sure.
So I'm bringing him up to interconnect this with what you've done in Lemuria and stuff like that. And then they find deserts that are glass, basically, from possible nuclear stuff. So
yes, that's right.
Why are they hiding all this from us? I mean, what have you came to the conclusion of that our government, our education system is keeping this from the people?
Control. The simple as that is control. Just like it says in 1984, whoever controls the past controls the future. That's absolutely correct. So you have to have a monolithic view of everything determined by the powers that be, because they want to control everything. The world is run by power freaks. Maybe it always has been, I don't know. But the world now is certainly run by power freaks. That means that these are people that are interested only in power for its own sake, nothing else. It has nothing to do with money or politics or anything. It's just pure power, money, politics, and economy and all the rest. That's just as a means to an end. And we are in a monolithic culture now, where everything has to be believed within certain rigid parameters, and those parameters are becoming more rigid as time goes on. And anyone who brings out alternative points of view is immediately either dismissed as a lunatic, a domestic terrorist, or just literally ignored. And this is the way of the world right now. It's a cycle, as you said. It's a down cycle. It's a kind of a dark ages, I suppose, you want to put it that way, dark age mentality. But civilizations go through the same patterns that a human body goes through. You're born, you go through a period of youth, maturity, decline, and death. Civilizations do exactly the same thing. All these civilizations that we study, they go through the same basic patterns. This was noted by a very great German historical philosopher after World War I. His name was Oswald Spengler. Wrote a book called The Decline of the West. And he said that Western civilization is caught in the same cycle that these other civilizations have been caught in. That's true to an extent, but there are some civilizations that went through extended golden ages that lasted thousands of years. Our society will be lucky if it lasts 300 years altogether, which is hardly more than an Egyptian dynasty. But then you have other societies like Lemuria, which began about 70,000 years ago, that long ago. It was born about 70,000 years ago, maybe more than that. Don't know just when, but after Mount Toba blew up, after 75,000 years ago. And it lasted all the way until we know its final gasp was 1917 BC. In other words, it lasted for tens of thousands of years. We know that it perished in 1917 BC because, I gave you the wrong date for that. It's 1628 BC. I was thinking of another aspect of Lemurian past, but 1628 BC, we know that this was a period of great trouble for the Earth. Earth came to a very difficult time because of a comet that came close to the Earth and showered down meteoric material that caused tsunamis and all kinds of geological disturbances. And this would appear to be associated with the final demise of Lemuria, which is in 1628 BC. Now, it lasted a long time, and its people weren't totally destroyed or annihilated. What they did is they mostly left, and they went to other parts of the world, Asia and the Americas, and throughout the Pacific, and they brought some of their high culture and shared it with other peoples and contributed to the growth of new civilizations in these various parts of the world. So the Lemurians really live on to a large extent, if not really as genetically as a people, certainly in their cultural heritage.
Now, did they look just like you and me? I mean, or were their skulls elongated like some of the findings that they found of these mummies?
No, they appear to be a modern-looking people. That they didn't seem to have been genetically that much different than you or myself. And but it's interesting you bring up these elongated skulls. Most of these skulls that have been found was the outcome of cranial deformation. In other words, when a child was born, a newborn came into the world, the child's head was strapped between two cloth-bound boards very gently but firmly. And then, of course, as you know, a child's head, an infant's head, is very malleable when it's first born. And over the forthcoming months and years, the child's head squeezed between these two boards would grow into a very long, oblong shape. And the reason why this was done was to mark this particular child in life as a member of an aristocracy. The aristocracy in ancient Egypt and in Peru and other places used head deformation as a mark to show that they were physically different than the lower orders of people, the lower classes. And it's kind of interesting, why would the Egyptians have done this, certain Egyptian dynasties, and why would somebody on the other side of the world in Peru do the exact same thing? So that indicates also, or suggests anyway, a connection of some kind. But these people were not born to look this way. They were artificially deformed.
Okay, so some people have speculated it could be people from the stars again.
Well, you know, I will give you this. It is very peculiar, is it not? It is. Why would an aristocracy want to make their people look physically that different? Why would they? And why would they want to make them look like aliens? Which they did. They would have looked like. If you would have seen one of these people in real life, you would have thought, "My God, this guy is from another world, another planet." You know, what is it that would have caused the ancient Egyptians and the Incas to have made their aristocracy look like what we refer to as aliens? I don't know. I'm not going to, as a scientist, and I do consider myself a true scientist. A true scientist is someone who considers all of the data and doesn't throw it out just because he doesn't happen to like it. So I have everything on the table. And if I'm not overly enthusiastic about an extraterrestrial connection, that doesn't mean I rule it out at all. It just means that I don't know enough about it, that's all. And I'm not critical of anyone else who says that they are able to perceive influences from these civilizations elsewhere. I granted that is entirely possible. I do not rule it out. It just isn't my own narrow field. I haven't come across enough of that to figure into the work I'm doing, that's all.
Well, and that's a very respectful position to be as a scientist, and I'm sure all of our listeners would agree with that, or most of them would. And when you talk about these cultures and they have advanced technologies, maybe not back in Lemuria, the Lemurian times, but previously, maybe let's say just a few thousand years ago, were there, or maybe even the Mayans, for example, with the research that you've done, were there like two classes of people? To the sense of, obviously, you've got the aristocratic bloodlines and then the workers, the slave-type people, etc. But were there technologies as well that you have found with some of these higher, I guess you could say, politically higher positions of power, people that had the money and the resources?
Well, amongst the Mayas, absolutely. The Maya, they actually had several classes, and the upper class was called the Pili, P-I-L-L-I. We don't know exactly what that means, literally, but it does apply to the Maya upper class. And they were the rulers, they were the movers and shakers, and then just below them were the Mahuels, and the Mahuels were the brains of the Maya civilization. And boy, were they brains. The mathematics that they were able to come up with was just astounding. Everybody knows, or at least heard about, the Mayan calendar. And the Maya did not invent the calendar, but they developed it to an extremely high degree. Nobody knows who invented the Maya calendar. That was it was inherited from a previous culture known as the Olmecs. And the Olmecs appeared not to have made the calendar either, but also inherited it from a previous people. And each one of these great American civilizations had in turn this calendar and elaborated and perfected it. And its final perfection is handed by the Mayas over time to the Aztecs. And the Aztecs enshrined it in something called the Aztec calendar stone. Very famous, of course. It's this disc that was found about 150 years ago in Mexico City when they were putting a new sewer system in. And this great disc amounts to nothing less than an astronomical computer of incredible sophistication. And the high mathematics involved is just absolutely mind-boggling, especially for a pre-modern people who have made something like this. So there you have one very obvious example of the very high level of technology that the ancients were able to achieve. Certainly the Aztec calendar stone outstripped the mathematics totally of the Spaniards who arrived and overthrew that civilization.
Right. And not to mention Chaco Canyon here in America, New Mexico.
Oh, that's incredible.
So
Chaco Canyon is just an unbelievable place. It doesn't go back that long ago. It goes back a little bit less than 1,000 years ago. But here's this totally unknown people called the Anasazi. And about 1,000 years ago, they wandered out into this most inhospitable area of North America. It's impossible to live there except for a few scattered tribes living a scrub existence. And in this Four Corners area, in this canyon, Chaco Canyon, they erected these immense structures that looked like condominiums, 5 stories high, amounting to something like 130 million bricks per structure. And that this place was made overnight, these buildings, and they are aligned to specific lunar and solar positions with incredible accuracy that we would find today very difficult to do. So, like you say, even here in the continental United States, you're finding great civilizations, and they lost it too, didn't they? They were not able to hang on to their civilization. They also went through a period of terrible decline, and they lost it all terribly. And now they're just ruins. That's the great tragedy of mankind, that man will be able to create these fabulous civilizations and keep them going for some period of time, and then eventually makes tragic mistakes and commits suicide. These civilizations are very rarely destroyed by military events. I mean, Troy is a famous example. Troy, of course, was wiped out by a war, but the vast majority of civilizations commit suicide. They implode, and Chaco Canyon was certainly, the Anasazi was certainly part of a self-destructive pattern that brought their civilization down, and now it's just dusty ruins, where before it was a thriving, great society. People that they were aligned with are even less well known. They're called the Hohokam, tremendously great people. They were not far from Chaco Canyon, and the Hohokam created an irrigation system that was just matchless. It was huge. It was gigantic. It was a modern irrigation system. If you took all of their canals and put them end to end, they would extend from Phoenix, Arizona, to past the Canadian border. And they used a kind of a cement called caliche. They made the desert bloom. And you would think that this society would go on forever, but it didn't. It self-destructed because it it abused certain classes of people, and the classes of people eventually revolted against the upper classes in a very terrible way and pulled the entire thing down. It wasn't good for anybody then. But this is what happens over and over again, whether it's Sumer or Chaco Canyon or the Mayas. Usually people commit the same self-destructive mistakes over and over again. Lemuria does not appear to have been a society like that. Lemuria doesn't seem to have gone through any of these cycles. That's because the Lemurians were very much like today's Tibetan Buddhists. The Lemurians were more interested in the spiritual destiny of a man's soul than how much money he had in his bank account. And they were a spiritually oriented people, like today's Tibetan Buddhists. If you ask the average Tibetan Buddhist, what is the meaning of life? And the meaning of life is to avoid reincarnation, to live such a valuable life that you don't have to go through samsara, or the repetition of souls on earth. So you live a noble and a virtuous life. It would have been similar to the Lemurians, who were interested in the development of the human soul. And if you have that kind of a point of view, you don't go through the materialistic cycles that most other societies go through.
And this could obviously be, this is just a philosophical thought, that maybe the Lemurians as a people, the overall archetype did evolve, and that was why maybe something happened to their culture to cause the demise of them, being that they were natural with the earth. They were about balance, it sounds like, not about building giant empires of dirt, as many people are today. So,
right.
And I guess I'd like to get back to your new work that you put together, and I really appreciate talking about this with us, because this is going to incorporate a lot of, what we're getting into, the overall theme of tonight's show. But what did the Knight Templars, they were really big for a while, and they supposedly sailed to Maine. Is that correct? And if it is, what kind of basis or facts do you have to back that up?
Quite a few, actually. I think our listeners have to first understand who were the Knights Templars. The Knights Templars were a Christian sect that were opposed to the Vatican. The Knights Templars were what is today would be known as Gnostic Christians. They believed that the last Christian died on the cross. They believed that the principles of Jesus had been abused after him and turned into this great power construct known as the Vatican, as the Roman Catholic Church. And so the Knights Templars tried to go back to what they felt were the original teachings of Jesus. And they call themselves Knights Templars because they were organized at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And they took their name from the Temple Mount, the Templars, and they were knights. And they fought for the Holy Land. They wanted to create a kind of a new Jerusalem in the Holy Land. Well, they failed to do that. But in any case, they did preserve among themselves in the secret society, which it was a secret society, the original principles they felt of Christianity. And they became very powerful over time. They attracted a lot of influence, financial and political, and they became such a threat to replacing the Vatican that the Vatican launched a war of extermination against them. It's called the Albigensian Crusade. That's, of course, against the Cathars, who were related to them. That's a whole other story. But nonetheless, they outlawed, proscribed the Knights Templars around 1300 A.D., and their leader, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake as an example to the rest of them. Well, when this happened, the Templars were in possession of a gigantic fleet, a huge fleet that sailed all the known and possibly the unknown oceans of the world at that time. This is, of course, about 200 years before Columbus, a little less than 200 years before Columbus. And the fleet, the Templars' fleet, disappeared. Could not be seized by the Vatican. We now know that the Templar fleet went to Scotland, and there it hooked up with the Sinclairs. The Sinclairs were a royal family that were not that friendly disposed to the Vatican, and so the Sinclairs welcomed the Knights Templars and their fleet. This fleet was used to extend the influence of the Sinclairs and to bring back wealth from the New World. I go into this in greater detail in my book. It's far too complex for us to discuss or in any kind of detail over the radio tonight, but it would appear that the Templars arrived in North America along with the Sinclair family from Scotland sometime in the early 14th century A.D. And probably the most convincing evidence for that is something called the Westford Night. And the Westford Night is this very pale sketch. You can barely make it out today. It's highly eroded, but it's the image of a medieval knight that appears on the side of a large boulder in Massachusetts. And it was found by some of the earliest pilgrims who arrived sometime, I guess, in the late 16th, early 17th century. So it's authentic. There's no doubt that it was not made in modern times, that it's not a hoax of any kind. And this very faint print, which it is today, was in much better shape about 60 years ago when it was photographed and studied. It was eroding then, but images exist to show what it really looked like up until about 1955 or so, 1954. There's a fellow by the name of Frank Glenn who made some of the most accurate, detailed photographic studies of the Westford Night. And when the photographs were taken and copies were sent to experts in Scotland to identify possibly the clothing that's portrayed on this fellow, on this etching, and to portray and to understand what kind of a weapon he's holding, looks like some kind of a sword. The information came back that they could identify exactly who this person was. His name was James Gunn, G-U-N. And James Gunn was an officer in the Knights Templar who was a Scottish member of the Knights Templar, was also a member of the Sinclair family, and here he is portrayed on the side of this boulder. Now, not too far, a couple hundred, I say maybe no more than about 100 miles or so from this wonderful portrayal of James Gunn, this Knights Templar in Massachusetts. In Rhode Island, there's something called the Newport Tower. And the Newport Tower is a small, rather crudely built, but nonetheless elegant-looking stone tower on Newport Bay. And it was originally believed to have been built by Benedict Arnold's father. Well, Benedict Arnold's father owned the property, as it turns out, that this Newport Tower is on, but Benedict Arnold's father did not build this tower. And recent studies have shown that the tower is exactly the same as the octagonal-shaped towers that were built by the Knights Templar in the 14th century, and that the alignments, this is interesting, the alignments that are the astronomical alignments that are incorporated into the structure of the Newport Tower are identical to the astronomical alignments at various Templar towers, especially in England. England has some of the greatest survivors of Templar architecture. The work there has been done by a fellow by the name of Scott Walter. And Scott Walter has got this great television show now. It's called America Unearthed, and I don't know that he's had that on his program yet, but he spent some years working on the Knights Templars' relationship to the Newport Tower. And in his book called The Hooked X, he makes a very convincing argument that, in fact, it only could be built by the Knights Templar. And there are many other proofs, physical evidence for the Knights Templar having been on the East Coast of the United States, and it's discussed in a whole chapter in its own in my book.
Wow, that's incredible. And there's been so many cultures of, the Native American cultures, different tribes. Did they have different records of overseas voyages to their lands before Columbus?
They had something much better than that, because they were not a literate people. They did not have a written language. They were like the Druids in England and France. The Druids also did not have a written language. And they believed that to write anything down was profane, and therefore they cultivated human memory.
Why is that?
Native Americans, because they believed that knowledge was sacred, and that once put down on paper, can be abused and becomes profane. And so if you were to go to a Druid college, you would go through long courses and to learn how to expand your memory. The ancient Hawaiians, and not even ancient, but the Hawaiians up until the time of Captain Cook, I believe, had very similar things where they had speakers. And these speakers could recite the genealogy of their chief, and they would go on for hours, all by pure power of memory. The Native Americans were similar to this. They did not have a written language. They had no documents like we have, which are subject to terrible loss. Like, for example, in the ancient world, where people did believe in written records, you had the library at Alexandria, and our ancestors put into that great library all of their knowledge. Well, it burned up, didn't it? It was totally destroyed. And there went the memory of mankind, and we've been trying to put the pieces together ever since. If you have something that's really important to a people, you enshrine it in myth. And myth is not a lie. Myth deals with a truth that a pre-modern people want to preserve for future generations, and so they'll dramatize it. And the myths of the Native Americans are just precisely that. They're not records in the sense that we have data and documents. They preserve important memories by dramatizing them in myth. And Native American myth is consistent in the stories of peoples from other parts of the world who arrived on the shores of North America and interacted with Native Americans, sometimes peaceably, sometimes not, sometimes intermarrying with them, sometimes killing them. Well, that's human nature all over. But nonetheless, Native Americans have a superb folk memory of these visitors from other parts of the world. An example of that is the Menominee Indians of northern Wisconsin. The Menominee Indians say that there was a white people who they refer to as the Sea People or the Marine Men, and that these people came to the shores of Lake Superior, and they wounded Mother Earth by extracting her shiny bones, which they highly valued. Well, if you go to the shores of Lake Superior, say in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, you'll find these ancient copper mines that were worked by a highly sophisticated people 3,000 and more years ago, 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, and in excess of 500 million pounds of the world's highest grade copper was mined by these people. And those are the shiny bones that are referred to by the Menominee Indians. That explains why Europe was able to have a Bronze Age. In order to create bronze, you need high-quality copper, zinc, and tin. Although you had zinc and tin to some extent in Europe, you had very poor and inadequate amount of copper. And here in Michigan, the Upper Peninsula, and the Great Lakes area, you had an abundance of the world's highest grade copper. So you combine that high-grade copper with zinc and tin, and you have bronze. And if you have bronze, you have weapons and tools which are far superior to the copper, stone, and wood implements of your opponents. And bronze was the nuclear fission of its day, and people would have gone to the ends of the earth, and they did, to get high-grade copper. And that story it's more than a story. That account, that historical fact, is enshrined in the Menominee Indians, who tell about these white-skinned foreigners who came for Mother Earth's shiny bones.
That's something else, and it makes sense. So now, are there rune stones in Oklahoma and Minnesota that a lot of people consider fake, but they're not?
Well, I would say that a lot of people don't consider them fake. The mainstream archaeologists do. But what's really kind of disappointing about that is that the mainstream archaeologists have never seen these rune stones. They don't examine them. They do not examine any of the facts that are related to them. They just dismiss them out of hand because these rune stones do not fit into their paradigm that Columbus was the first and only discoverer of America. In Oklahoma, there have been 5 rune stones that have been found, and I write about all of them in their own chapter in The Lost Colonies of Ancient America. All of these rune stones were found under completely unimpeachable conditions and situations. They were not found by anyone trying to profit from them in any way, to fool the archaeologists or to make a buck. They were found by accident in each case. The most outstanding example is the Havener rune stone. The Havener rune stone is not really a stone. It's a boulder. It's a gigantic boulder. And on the side of this boulder is inscribed a runic name. And the runic name is Gnome Medal. And Gnome Medal in Norse means the Valley of the Gnomes. And that might be a reference to the Native American people, we're not sure, or it might be the name of a particular person. Now, that rune stone is described as being a fake by mainstream archaeologists, that somebody just hoaxed it up. Well, the trouble with that is that the Native Americans controlled that area of Oklahoma just before the Civil War. In other words, no white man was allowed into this particular area. It was set aside as a reservation, and no white man had ever been in there. Well, the Native Americans knew about that rune stone. Can you see the Oklahoma Indians carving runes? I don't see that as too, in order to fool archaeologists or make a buck. That doesn't fit somehow. So the Native Americans knew about that. The Havener runestone was first seen by white hunters right around the time of the Civil War, and they marked out. They thought it was an Indian sign. They didn't have any knowledge at all about Nordic runes. They referred to it always as an Indian sign. The Indians there said, "No, we never made it. We don't know what that is. That's been there for a long time." So when the runes were studied scientifically by runologists, they found that the runes forms is an early form of what they call futhark. Futhark is a name that's applied to various runic forms, and that this particular form of futhark goes back to about the year 1000. Well, that's interesting because in the year 1000, that's when Leif Erikson was making his historic voyages to North America. So there's no doubt that this is an authentic runestone that's not faked, and that when it's seen in conjunction with the other 4 runestones, which also have similar place names, there's no doubt that the Native Americans were telling the truth, that these are not Indian signs. They were made by somebody else, and those other people were obviously Norse. And the Norse had penetrated. That's the incredible thing. The Norse had penetrated that far into America, into Oklahoma, that long ago. Well, why not? If you had a ship that could take you anywhere, of course, the Viking ships, the dragon ships, they were some of the finest sailing craft ever invented. It would take you anywhere. They were as unsinkable as a ship could be because they could wriggle through the high seas. They were what is known as lab-straked. They weren't solid hulls. They were made to be very flexible, one plank attached to another and sewn to another in some cases. So this would give the hull tremendous flexibility and strength. So with a craft like that, hey, why not? You can go any place you want to go. And some Norse did go to Oklahoma and carve his name on there, either his name or a reference to the valley, Gnome Medal.
Now, is it still there?
Yes, it is. As a matter of fact, it is a park that the state of Oklahoma was convinced by a wonderful gal by the name of Gloria Farley, who fought the archaeologists for decades, who wanted to just destroy it or completely ignore it. And she was able to put on her case for the authenticity of the Gnome Medal inscription to such an extent that the state of Oklahoma granted its protection. And you can go there to this day and to Havener, Oklahoma, and you can see the Havener runestone. It's protected behind a plexiglass front, and you can see it.
Yeah, very nice, very nice. So, if it's okay, maybe I could get into another book that you put together called "Before Atlantis: 20 Million Years of Human and Pre-Human Cultures."
Sure, I'd be glad to discuss that.
Now, that is absolutely fascinating, getting into something that's, 4, 5, 10, 20 million years old. I read an article about a perfect glass brick wall that had almost mirror-like bricks that was discovered in coal deposits that are approximately 100 million years old under the earth. Now, I don't know how it got there, what it is, who built it, but tell us some, just amazing things that you have learned that would make somebody just go, wow, unbelievable.
It is. It's unbelievable. These objects, like this glass wall that you've described, can only have been placed where they were found by one of two ways. There is either some kind of they are either modern, in other words, they're only maybe 100 years old or more, and they have somehow got into these deep deposits through geological processes which are not understood. That's possible, but highly unlikely, because when these things like this glass wall and there's another one is a hammer, for example, that was found in deposits that are millions of years old that are undisturbed. That's the thing. These deposits are undisturbed. The stratigraphy is not moved. So these things are either somehow filtered down through geological forces that are unknown, that's unlikely, or else they were built by human hands millions of years ago. Well, what does this mean? Well, the mainstream scientists tell us, for example, that the very first human beings in America arrived here no more than 12 to 15,000 years ago, maximum. As a matter of fact, we're told that the first and only human beings that arrived in the Americas came from Siberia, across a land bridge. And they wandered across this land bridge maybe 15,000 years ago, and they stayed in Alaska for thousands of years, and then eventually they trickled down into what is now the continental United States, maybe 12, 15,000 years ago at the very earliest, not before then, and that all Native Americans are descended just from these people that crossed from Siberia. They're all Siberians, right? Well, in 1970, a gal by the name of Virginia Steen McGintyre was called in. She is a professional, university-trained archaeologist, and beyond that, she is a world-class expert in dating materials that have been burned by fire. And archaeologists in 1970 found an old campfire outside of Mexico City. And they didn't know how old this campfire was. They knew it was made by human beings and it was really old, but they didn't know how old it was. They figured, it could go back maybe 10,000 years. That's a long time. So they called in Virginia, and she studied the remains of this campfire site. And they found things like, bones of certain animals that had been butchered at the site and that had been cooked, and other remains of people that had been there. And so for the next several years, she and her colleagues did their testing, and they found that the campfire site was older than they were willing to admit. So they retested everything, and the results came up the same. And the results, when they were released, created quite an upset situation, because she was able to determine that this campfire site was 250,000 years old, 250,000 years old. Well, her colleagues reviewed all her work and found that she had done everything impeccably correct, and that her results were 100% correct. And for this, she was literally booted out of Mexico. Her materials were confiscated by the Mexican authorities, and she was literally drummed out of the profession. She wound up selling flowers for a living because she could no longer practice archaeology. Give you some idea of the extent, the vindictiveness, the professional jealousy of her colleagues. About 15 years later, another campfire site was found north of Mexico City. Virginia's was found west. That campfire site also dated to 250,000 years ago by people who had nothing to do with Virginia at all, didn't hardly know what she had done. Now, these facts are known, but they are not publicized. You will not see them on television. You certainly won't read about them in textbooks, but they've been known for decades now. And that's an example how there was someone who knew how to make fire around Mexico City 250,000 years ago, when the textbooks tell you that there was nobody in Mexico but more than about 10,000 years ago. That's quite a big difference. That's quite a big difference. And then when you go back even further, it's amazing the things that are found. Human beings, supposedly, I mean, we're not even talking modern human beings, right? We're just talking about our hominid ancestors. We go back maybe 4 million years ago. That's it, maximum. And they, if you were to see somebody from 4 million years ago, they wouldn't bear much a resemblance to anybody we see today. But our hominid ancestors began about then. And they, I guess Homo sapiens, pretty much looking like us, maybe 2 million or less years ago. Well, there was a archaeologist in Argentina, the early part of the 20th century. His name was Armagino, and he was considered, and still is considered, South America's greatest archaeologist. There's even a crater on the moon named after him today. His textbooks are read all over academia. And Armagino made a discovery on the shores of Argentina that was beyond criticism at the time. No one has commented on since, hardly anybody, except people like Michael Cremo and myself. And Armagino found evidence for tool making now, not just for human beings, but for tool makings. In other words, human beings that knew what they were doing, like, proto-civilized people. Tool making, my friend, that goes back 20 million years. And this wasn't just one or two tools. It was an entire tool industry that Armagino uncovered on the shores of Argentina. 20 million years. And supposedly, human beings didn't even begin until 4 million years ago. Here we're talking 20 million years. How is that possible? Did he make a mistake? Could he have erred somehow? Well, no, because others before and since him have also found toolkits on the shores of Argentina that date back to about 20 million years. And that dating is clear because it's in the geological record. It's found now, I think they've found at least 4 or 5 different sites in Argentina, and the geological dating is all the same. What are we to make of such a thing? The mainstream scientists say that we're only 4 million years old, and here's somebody who's making tools 20 million years ago.
That's
How is
insane.
that possible?
It's insane. So do you think that could be possibly time travel? Or do you think that it's actually, there were people around at that time that were using tools maybe even 20 million years before that?
What's interesting, too, is Armagino's tools were made out of quartzite. And that, if you use tools out of quartzite, that's considered diagnostic of a pretty sophisticated tool maker. I mean, not just crummy stones that are blocked out, in a rough hammer shape. If you're working with quartzite, because that takes some finesse, and they were flaked, and they were beautifully done. As far as time travel and all that, as a true scientist, you can't throw anything out, nothing, any of the evidence that comes to your table. And I can tell you this through experience, that I've had certain pieces of information have come to me that I've totally rejected. This is ridiculous, I can't possibly use this, and I throw it out. And then years later, oh my God, that piece of evidence was valid after all. Where is it? I have to go after it now. So you can't really, as a true scientist, you have to consider everything fairly, the most fantastic of them all and the most obvious in front of you. But you have to be selective. What works for you now? As far as time travel is concerned, I don't know, it's possible. But I think maybe more possible is that human beings have evolved several times, and that we have come into existence and gone out of existence, and that what we are now we trace back to about 4 million years ago. But there are other human beings who evolved much earlier, rose to certain levels of social being, and then something happened, and that they became extinct. We ourselves came very close to extinction 75,000 years ago. I mean, we were poised on the brink. We could have gone any which way, and nature wouldn't have cared a rap. Many species come and go. There are more gone species than there are species here now. And we're no exception to that whatsoever. So I think that it's possible. My theory is, and it's only a theory, but it's the only one that I can get my head around, is that these objects that you discussed and so forth, they represent human beings who have been around and evolved long before ourselves. Another piece of information that tends to show that are the footprints that are found amongst dinosaur footprints. And they've been found not only in the United States, they've also been found in Russia and other parts of the world. So it isn't just like some fluke, but there have been human footprints found walking. That a human being was walking along a river bank in the company of dinosaurs. That's 65 million years ago. If it was only one instance of this, I would say, it's just some anomaly of some kind, to be explained. But no, it's been found in several places in the world. So I think, yes, I think human beings have... We're not talking about the same human beings that we are and that these people that existed 20 or 65 million years ago. I think that the human type has evolved and gone extinct several times.
Which, could also bring the possibility of some of these paintings, these cave paintings that are, I think there's one in France that's 27,000 years old of these,
yes,
like astronauts.
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
So
you have to wonder why is all this. These cave paintings are incredibly sophisticated. They are not crude. They're modern works of art, and yet they're obsessed with the sky. You have to wonder, why is that? I mean, there's a lot of other things to be obsessed about. Why the obsession with it? For example, at Lascaux, that's the most famous of all of the cave paintings. They go back about maybe 20,000 years ago, not quite 20,000 years ago. And it turns out that all these representations of bison and aurochs and all these other animals and so on, they're constellations. They're representations of the sky. And here it is, hundreds of feet below the surface of the earth, deep in these caves, total darkness. And then there's these representations of the Pleiades, and what is all that about? I have to, so I can't dismiss any of this at all. I really can't. And there are stories of myths, not just stories, but there are myths of what it might be contacts with other people that are outside of our realm of existence here. It's entirely possible. Like I said, I'm too ignorant of these things for me to speak authoritatively on them. I can only talk about what I know or what I think I know. And I don't know, but I don't rule any of it out. Look at this. We send a spacecraft to Mars, and it goes to Mars, and it walks around, and it takes soil samples, and makes all kinds of noises and everything else, and that's completely acceptable. Well, we send a probe to Mars. It does all this. Well, why couldn't somebody else do the same thing to us? I mean, it seems unimaginable that somebody else would send a probe here, land, and take soil samples. I mean, turnabout is fair play, right? I mean, what's good for the goose is good for the gander,
Or could it also be possibly, like you said before, we're predating human-like history to 20 million years, and it's as if, there's these evolutionary cycles where people get killed off, only a select amount live, and then they rebuild some type of evolution. Maybe it could be our ancestors in the past. Something happened on the earth. They left. They came back. And the people that were, at the time on Earth looked at them like, gods or people from other planets. Who knows? I mean, obviously that's all in the realm of speculation. But, and that kind of brings me to the next thing. You were talking about the Knights Templars and how they were Gnostic Christians, and how the Great Tower of Alexandria was burned down with all that knowledge and information many years ago. So a lot of our history we have lost. And being Gnostics, have you done much research into the Nag Hammadi treaties, which were the Gnostic texts of Christianity back in the day?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Of course, they only came to light in 1947, and these Gnostic texts were made by a group of people that are descended from the same group that made them. They're called the Copts, C-O-P-T-S. They're a Christian sect in Egypt today. And I got a chance to know a couple of Coptic Christians when I was over there some years ago. And their version of Christianity is different than Catholicism or Protestantism or any other form of Christianity. They like to go back to the original, what they feel are the original concepts that Jesus taught, which are kind of different. Their concepts are that you don't need a priest or a pope or a church or anything like that at all, really. One of the lines from the Nag Hammadi text, or the Gospel according to Thomas, as it's referred to as, is that where Jesus is quoted as saying, they ask him, what about the kingdom? Somebody asks Jesus, what is the kingdom of God? Where is it? Where and when will it come? And he says, the kingdom of God is spread upon the earth and no man sees it. So what that means, of course, is that there's a bit of self-reliance going on here, So and this is basically what the Templars took on. See, the reason why the Templars became Gnostics is because when they came to Jerusalem, it would appear that they found certain texts, like the Nag Hammadi texts, that kind of undercut Vatican Christianity. And as a consequence, they adopted this Gnostic cult of their own, which was the cult of the Knights Templar. And then after they got whacked, another group very similar to them, they're back to closely related to them, were the Cathars, and they kept going with the concept of Christian Gnosticism, which is apparently what Jesus was. Jesus, apparently, according to these texts, was not interested in founding a church to the extent that there were buildings and holdings and statues and all that involved. But the church was just a body of human beings who believed that you don't need priests or anything like that to have a direct relationship with God. At least that's the main idea behind the Gospel according to Thomas that was found about 60-some years ago.
Well, and also there's a book in there called the Secret Book of John, which talks about completely different Genesis. It has, different versions of Genesis, and it talks also about the archons, etc. Have you been able to do much research or get much evidence on any of the stuff that's in those texts?
It's really difficult, but I have looked into it. I wrote. I don't mean to promote all my books here, but I did write a book on it. It's called Opening the Ark of the Covenant. And I did look into some of those things and how it related to the Ark of the Covenant. And the whole idea of the Ark of the Covenant is that it is just as its name suggests. A covenant is a kind of a pact or an agreement between human beings and God. And in this covenant, which is symbolized by the Ark, there's no need for actually even any theology. It's just immediate love and recognition of God, and that nothing else anything that stands between a human being and God is considered wrong. And that's basically what's enshrined in these early texts. You have to understand that when the church got going, it became like governments ever since or today. It became a power phenomena in itself. And the Bible that we have, the Old Testament and the New Testament, is the result of something called the Nicene Creed, the Nicene Council, rather. And the Nicene Council was where all these bishops and cardinals got together, and they literally threw out books of the Bible, just literally threw out a lot. And they edited and re-edited those books of the Bible they thought could be used in their idea of theology, and that's where our Bible really emanates from. Things like the Old Testament and the New Testament were written before then, of course, but they were, as it were, re-edited, and many things like the Book of Thomas and the Book of John thrown out. And if you disagreed with any of that, you were killed. One was like the Arian heresy. There was a group of Christians who were also Gnostics and didn't believe that so many books of the Bible should be thrown out, and they were hunted down and burned at the stake. They were killed. They were just liquidated. The Copts were another one. That's why the Nag Hammadi texts, or rather the Book of Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas, was buried at Nag Hammadi deliberately to protect it, because the church was on a rampage, killing off all of its heretics. So the original idea of all this stuff was that you don't need organized religion because God is there. God is your father. I mean, you need somebody else to have a relationship with your own father. You don't need somebody to come in and tell you what to do. You love your father. He loves you, and there's your relationship. That's all you need. But religion is like sex or anything else. It can be exploited and used by the power freaks that still run the world today. As I said, maybe they've always done that.
Right. It can be used and abused like anything else. And you bring up some really good points about the editing, the retranslations, and then also what people decided to canonize it based upon their, what they wanted to take place. But,
right, exactly.
It's quite fascinating. So, and I think it's great that people do have their own beliefs and opinions. Obviously, if we all thought the same, we'd be like cyborgs, and it would be boring. There'd be no reason to be here. That's the
that's what the system is after, of course. To make us all obedient cyborgs.
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah, be a transhuman. Just plug in, man. All you got to do is plug in, and everything will be okay. It's
exactly. Yeah.
So, what would you say the most fascinating discovery of your career, absolutely most amazing thing you found in your career has been?
There's so many.
I can tell you. Put you on the spot.
I know. I can tell you one off the top of my head. I thought was just terrific. For many, many years, it's been known that the ancient Egyptian medical practitioners were first rate. I mean, we're talking about a people that existed 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, and they had eye surgery and brain surgery, and they were good at it. The mummies preserved so well the effects of these operations, and it's been known for a long time that the Egyptian doctors had a very high success rate of brain surgery, well over 85%. That's amazing. And their eye surgery was fabulous. But the question always was, how on earth did they have something like brain surgery and eye surgery without any anesthesia? How is that possible? So they never understood how that came to be until 1991. In 1991, curators at the Cairo Museum, which is the big Egyptian museum in Cairo, were renovating Egyptian mummies that had been deteriorating somewhat. And so they were trying to keep them from decaying. And there were also some new studies being done. Like no one understood how the Egyptians were able to mummify their dead so well. So they used this as an excuse to examine the mummies more thoroughly and try to find out the secrets of how they were mummified. Well, during the process of renovating the mummies and trying to figure out their mummification process, the curators were astounded to find traces of cocaine. That's like impossible, because cocaine has never grown, nor does it grow to this day in the Nile Valley. It doesn't grow anywhere in Africa at all. It doesn't grow anywhere in the ancient old world. It grows only in northern Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador, no place else. Well, as they continued, they found more and more traces of cocaine in Egyptian mummies. And these mummies spanned the dynasties, from the earliest dynasties, about 5,000 years ago, all the way up into the Roman period. Cocaine. They found cocaine in the mummies of men, women, and children of all classes. Could not understand how this happened. They had pathologists come in to examine this if there had been any extrusive. In other words, if the curators were taking cocaine and were breathing into the mummies, which was ridiculous. And of course, it didn't happen. Then they had paleobotanists involved over the course of time, and it was determined beyond a shadow of a doubt that the ancient Egyptians had imported cocaine from South America, that the Egyptians came to South America, the ancient Egyptians, specifically for cocaine. And they needed cocaine because they made it in the medical practitioners made it in their mixtures for an anesthesia, and it's because of the presence in the cocaine that they were able to have their highly successful brain and eye operations. Now, since this discovery was made in the early 1990s, and it was debated all through the 90s, it was only until about 97 or 98 that the investigators had excluded all other conceivable possibilities, did they determine that this was cocaine that had been raised in South America. So here you have unequivocal proof that the Egyptians came to the Americas not just as castaways, but came here deliberately for a very specific purpose. This is the thing that I think really impressed me when I was putting the book together, and it's not. I take no credit for it at all, but it's interesting, the results, and that is that these various ancient peoples, whether they were Sumerians or Egyptians or Templars, they all came to the Americas for different agendas. They came here for different reasons, and they were very similar to today's modern corporations. Today you have industrial secrets, you have industrial espionage. One corporation will very jealously guard its own particular industrial secrets from its competitor. And I think that's exactly what the ancient world was involved in when it came to America. America then, as now, was a place of great natural wealth, and they wanted monopolies on that wealth so that their competitor kingdoms or nations, not nations, kingdoms, wouldn't be able to muscle in on their monopolies. That is the reason why, one of the contributing reasons why most people don't know about these ancients who came here, because the ancients themselves wanted it secret. The Egyptians did not want others to know the secret of their medical practitioners. When the Sumerians came here, they did not want their competitors to know where they were getting cotton. That's what they mostly came for. The Sumerians loved cotton. They could not raise it in Mesopotamia. It would not grow there. They had to import it at very great expense from India. Indian manufacturers charged them an arm and a leg for cotton. So that's why they came to Peru. We do know that this ziggurat, the Sumerian ziggurat, which is in Caral, Peru, was the center of cotton production. So that's the reason why they came here. And that's the reason why these peoples kept these things secret. And when the ancient world collapsed, when it fell, those secrets were lost. And it was up to Columbus to try to piece together the tiny fragments of knowledge from the ancient world so that he was able to launch his own discovery of America. None of this, by the way, detracts from Columbus at all. He was a very great man. What he did is he went to America based on virtually nothing. He had heard legends and rumors about the ancients having come here, but he did not know anything more than that because that information was lost with the collapse of the Greco-Roman world. He was part of the Renaissance, and the Renaissance means a new beginning, and the Renaissance was made possible because of the ancient knowledge that was being resurrected by bits and pieces, and Columbus was part of this resurrection that went on. So his achievement cannot be diminished at all by the previous peoples that arrived here before him, because he knew virtually no one knew about this. And the ancients have really no one but themselves to blame that this knowledge became lost because they did not share it publicly. They wanted their monopolies for the goods that they got here, like the copper miners. They didn't want to share that copper with anybody. If they became the great copper brokers of the ancient world, they became phenomenally wealthy. They're not going to share that with anyone else.
All right. Well, I really appreciate you coming on here tonight with us. I mean, this has just been a plethora of information. What would you like to share with our audience before we say goodnight?
Well, if anyone is interested in obtaining copies of any of my books, and especially this latest one, which is The Lost Colonies of Ancient America, they may do so by dialing a toll-free telephone number. It's operative 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's 877-494-0044. And if they want any additional information online, I have a website that I'm still connected with. It's www.ancientamerican.com. That's all one word, lowercase, ancientamerican.com, and it has a number of my books and other things related to what we're speaking about this evening.
Great. I appreciate that.
A very special thank you to our guest tonight. For all of you that had the opportunity to be here with us, if you enjoyed the show, follow us on YouTube, youtube.com/clandestine Time Lord, for the most recent interviews, videos, and podcasts. Or you can check us out on the World Wide Web, www.leakproject.com. Would you like to be a guest on our show? Do you have information that the world needs to see and hear? Send us an email, guestbookings@leakproject.com. Thank you, everybody. This is Rex Bear with Leak Project. Stay safe and be the change you want to see. Good night.